Hello, this is John from caveofprogramming.com, and in this tutorial we're going to look at the iterable interface, and we're going to look at implementing the iterable interface ourselves so that we can create a class, a collection class that you can loop over with a for each type loop. So in the last tutorial we looked at using iterable collections with the for each kind of syntax. And we're going to go one step further here and create our own iterable class. So I'm going to, as an example, I'm going to right click here and I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to call this, let's call this URL library, and I'll imagine that this is a class that can store a list of URLs, initially at least. So let's give this a private, let's say, linked list of strings. So I'm going to store a list of strings which will be URLs, and I'll call this URLs, and I'll set it equal to a new linked list of string, and I'll put the brackets in there and add the import for linked list. Now I'll give this a constructor, and just for sort of demo purposes here really, I'll just add some URLs here in the constructor, but you could supply methods here if you want to add URLs so that this class stores URLs that you pass to it. For example, let's say urls.add, and I'll add http://www.caveofprogramming.com. That's my website. And let's just have a couple more URLs here. I keep pressing the wrong characters on my keyboard because I've got two keyboards and I'm forever getting confused between them. Let's also have www.facebook.com/caveofprogramming, where you can find my Facebook page. And and I'll also add just one more. I'll add one website that I look at a lot, coming from the UK, which is news.bbc.co.uk. Okay, now how can we make it so that you can iterate through this list using a for each loop when you create an object, a URL library object, here in the main program? So let's just create one to start with, equals new URL library. And if I want to use for each to iterate over those URLs within this library here, what I can do is I can say that the URL library implements iterable, which is an interface, of course. And because the URLs are strings here, I'm going to say that it implements iterable string. So the URL library itself is not going to be a template class, and I'm just going to say that it can only iterate through strings because it only stores strings. And these strings could be any object. It could be some custom object that you've created yourself. They don't have to be strings. So I'll add the import with Ctrl-Shift-O, and let's look at this error here, and I'm going to go to add unimplemented methods like this, and that has added this public iterator method, which is the sole method of the iterable interface. And because I've said this is implementing iterable and I've used the string template parameter, this iterator here is an iterator over strings. And I have to return from here an iterator object, and the iterator object is an object that has the methods next, has next, and remove, and it's capable of basically pointing at each of your objects that you want to iterate over in turn. Now the simplest way to implement this here, and we'll look at our kind of interesting refinement of this in a minute, but the simplest thing to do is use the iterator that already exists in this linked list. So here I could just say return urls.iterator, and that will return an iterator to the objects in this linked list. And the whole point of that is that now I can say, when I use the URL library class and create an object from it, I can say for string, because this implements iterable string, for string URL in URL library, and I can say, whoops, if I could just hit the right key there, there we go. I can say sysout and URL. So I can use a for each loop on objects of this class here, just because that class implements iterable, and if I run that, then I'll get my URLs. Now, why would you want to do that? And well, I suppose the answer is you don't want to do it very often, but typically you want to do it. Well, it could just be a convenience thing, like here, maybe you just think it looks nice to be able to iterate directly over your object. Or it could be that you want to iterate over the objects you're storing in some kind of custom order that this kind of the iterator of your list or whatever it is doesn't support. Or it could be even that there is just no iterator. You're either storing the objects in a way that there's no ready-made iterator for them, or you might even want to fetch these objects somewhere as you're iterating through them. And let's take a look at an example of that latter case here, where you're actually fetching the objects you want to iterate through as you iterate through them. So let's comment this out actually. And what I'm about to show you is kind of a demo of a very particular case, just to show you kind of what kind of use, for example, you might want to put this to. And I'm going to implement my iterator method again here. So I've got my method that returns an iterator, and now I'm going to create my own iterator. So not only am I going to implement iterable here, I'm also going to implement iterable, and I'm actually going to download these web pages as I go through the URLs as I iterate through them, so that here in my main program I can actually get HTML from the downloaded websites as I iterate through them. So to do that, I'm going to create an inner class here, because if I create an inner class, it will still have access to this URLs field. And if I created a separate class to implement iterator, then I could also do that, and I could just pass these URLs in its constructor, for example. But here what I'll do is I'll just say private, let's call this URL iterator, and I'll say this implements iterator, and because the fact that it implements iterator means I can return it from my iterator method. And I need an iterator over strings here, because I've said that this class URL library implements iterable of the string type. So here I'm going to say implements iterator string, and I'm going to return the HTML of my websites as strings. So here's my iterator class, and let's just add the import there. Actually, I think I've already got the import. I need to say private class actually. Here we go. So private class URL iterator, quite hard to say that, implements iterator of string. Now if I click on this error message here and add on unimplemented methods, now I need to implement the various methods that iterator has. Now I could throw some kind of unimplemented exception, I forget the exact name here, for remove, or I could supply a remove method. Let's just supply a remove method, and let's say URLs. In fact, before I do that, I need to have some notion of where this iterator is positioned in these URLs, like which URL is this pointing at the moment, because an iterator is always, loosely speaking, it's pointing at an object in some sense. So let's have an index here. Let's say private int index, and I'll set it equal to 0 to start with, although the initialization is superfluous because a private member field of the type int would be initialized to 0 by default anyway. But just for clarity, I'll set this equal to 0. And now if the user calls remove, I'll just say urls.remove, and I'll use the remove method that takes an int argument of linked list, and I'll remove the URL that my iterator here, this iterator, is currently pointing at. Now the two really interesting methods here are hasNext and next. HasNext will have to return true if there's another URL or another website to iterate through, and false if there isn't. So let's say as long as the index here is less than 3, well, it's less than the size of the number of URLs that I've got in this linked list, then there is another one to look at. So say I've got 3 URLs in my list here. They will be numbered 0, 1 and 2, and I can retrieve them with this index 0, 1, 2, and as long as this index is less than 3, then there is another URL that I can look at after the current one. So let's just say return index is less than urls.size, and this condition here will be true as long as index is less than 3 in this case, because I've got 3 URLs that I added in my constructor here. And if it's equal to 3 or greater than 3, this condition will be false to say there isn't a next URL to look at. Now the next method, it has to increment my index. Let's do that to start with so I don't forget. And it has to return a string, and the string is going to be a string representing the object that I'm currently looking at. And it also has to wind forward to the next object, so that's why I'm incrementing index here. But before we increment it, we need to return the current object. And I'm going to return here the actual downloaded HTML of each of these URLs. So to do that, and this isn't specific in any way to collections, but I'll just create a bit of code here. I'll create a URL object, URL which equals urls.get, and I'll pass the index there to my linked list to get the URL that my current index here is pointing at. And let's add the import for URL, Control-Shift-O, and then click on this, and oh yeah, what am I doing? I actually need to say equals new URL, because I need to pass the string version of the URL to the constructor of my URL object. And now I can surround with try catch, because that throws a malformed URL exception. And now I can go ahead and download the HTML, and to do that I need to create a buffered reader. So I need to say buffered reader, let's call this br equals new buffered reader, and my buffered reader is going to map a input stream reader. Sorry, it's going to wrap, did I say wrap or map? It's going to wrap an input stream reader like this. So new input stream reader, and the input stream reader is going to wrap the return value of url.getInputStream. So let's say here url.open stream, and I'll just add the input so with Control-Shift-O, and now we'll have a error here because this throws IO exception somewhere along the way. I think this open stream does. So let's just change this to an exception so I can catch them all in one catch block. And I could do something more interesting and more user-friendly than just print a stat trace here, but I'll just leave this here because this is not kind of really anything to do with what I'm trying to show you here. And now finally I can go ahead and read the URLs. Let's create a string builder, sb equals new string builder, to store the lines that I'm going to retrieve of HTML from this website. And I'm going to say string line, and I'll set that equal to null initially to avoid uninitialized variable warnings, and I'll say while line equals br buffered reader dot read line, and while that whole thing is not equal to null. So I've got this in its own set of brackets here, and I'm saying while the line which is read from bufferedReader.readLine is not equal to null, just loop through here and append the line to my string builder like this, and I'll also append a new line character because read line discards the new line character, sort of eats the new line character. And after I've finished reading all the HTML that I can, I must remember to close my stream. So I'll say here buffered reader dot close, which will close the underlying stream. And finally, down here, after incrementing my index to say that, yeah, I've finished with this website, we've already read it now, then, and that this kind of moves my iterator forward to the next URL. Now I can say return string builder.toString. So I'm finally returning my string. And actually, I need to take this string builder out of the try catch block and declare it up here so that I can now refer to it down here, string builder.toString. And the very last step here is that I can now, in my iterator method, which has to get my iterator, I can say return new URL iterator. There we go. So it's quite a lot of code. Most of it was just downloading the website, actually. And you can sort of, as long as you know about inner classes and you've got an idea of what you want to do and what iterator does, you can sort of wing it, really. You just have to click on the arrows and go to add unimplemented methods. And then the methods like has, next, and next, as long as you understand what they're supposed to do, then it's fairly easy to implement them, relatively speaking. And now let's just output here sysout URL. Well, this is no longer a URL, it's actually HTML now. So let's say HTML here dot length to see how much data we've downloaded. And then later on I could output my HTML, but I'll just comment this out for a minute. And what's going to happen now is that whenever I call next on my iterator, it actually, so doing for each on an iterator is actually behind the scenes calling, this is actually calling next on your iterator from URL library here, as long as has next returns true. So behind the scenes we're going to be calling that next method, even though there's no visible reference to it here, but that's what this kind of for each syntax does. And it's gonna, this is going to execute slowly, so you might want to put it in its own thread in real life, but it's going to retrieve the URLs one by one. It's going to retrieve the HTML from these URLs one by one. And if I run this now, we get, this is the number of characters that we're returning from those websites. And if I uncomment this, we can actually see the actual HTML from those websites, chunk by chunk, page by page. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial, and we strayed a little bit off the topic in a way of iterators, but I thought it might be interesting to show you a kind of real example and actually doing something that's a little bit interesting, downloading from a website. And in the next tutorial we're going to probably look at complex data types using collections packages and building up a kind of complex data type, like for example a timetable using multiple collections. So join me again then, and you can find this code on caveofprogramming.com, where you can also find information about more free videos on programming Android, servlets, JSPs, on multi-threading, Java Swing, and lots of other stuff. So until next time, happy coding.